Hi, everyone. I want to talk today about my most recent article, which was published last week in Inside Sources. And the title of the article is uh, Legalizing Betting Markets Would Promote a Culture of Expert Accountability. So the impetus for this article was that I basically wanted to introduce a new argument into a debate that I think is going to heat up and that already is breaking down along very familiar lines and arguments that I think in many ways are insufficient, if not outdated. So just by way of background, basically last May, the Supreme Court struck down a federal law which prohibited commercial sports betting at the state level. And this basically opened the door now to allow individual states to basically deregulate betting markets. And you're likely to see now a spate of new laws enacted next year. Now, this is the pertinent issue for states with a potential to really invest in the commercial sports betting industry. This is a roughly $150 billion industry, and it's likely to keep growing and so forth. Now, one of the things that happened is, recently now in December, Senators Chuck Schumer and Orrin Hatch announced a bipartisan piece of legislation, or they announced their plans to introduce a bipartisan piece of legislation that would basically now try to circumvent the Supreme Court decision and regulate sports betting with new federal standards. And state level too, what you're seeing is this debate now over commercial sports betting is basically falling down along very familiar lines, which are lines that tend to accompany gambling, lotteries, any kind of gambling generally. And it basically ends up hitting people who believe that gambling is either immoral or destructive to the culture or to different people who partake in it, versus the people who basically argue that, look, you have a massive multi-million-dollar industry. If you take tax revenues from that ultimately people will be better off from it. And I think this is an old paradigm. I think it's one that doesn't sufficiently account for a third argument that I want to introduce and that I introduce in the argument in the piece here, which is basically that there is a civic argument for legalizing betting markets because they have the potential to really promote a better discourse, a new culture of expert accountability, and ultimately one that can help to maybe contribute to a richer political dialogue, one decay. So one of the things that I talk about in the article is there's a recent book by Naval War College professor Tom Nichols. It's called The Death of Expertise. And Nichols basically looks at why we've had this erosion in our political discourse and culture where basic reality, basic facts, basic forms of expertise are being questioned, and why we have this renaissance of fake news, politicians that just routinely lie, where illiteracy doesn't have the same kind of consequences. And one of the points that Nichols makes in his book is that much of the public skepticism facing our institutions are driven by the fact that expert predictions and forecasts are in fact consistently wrong. They're in fact consistently off base. And so it's not terribly surprising that when people see that people in power, that established authorities are just downright wrong, that it's not surprising to see a broader erosion of trust in our society. Now, I think that I've talked about this before, that I think we do in fact have a crisis where public intellectuals and experts and so forth, whatever they're contributing to the debate, when it comes to prediction and forecasting, which I would argue is ultimately a clear metric for whether or not someone really has a sensible model for understanding the world, that they are in fact wrong and this is a problem. But the reason we don't is because we don't have a culture more generally where we have accountability and where there are clear incentives to making accurate predictions. Now, the argument I make in the article here is that betting markets and more generally a culture of gambling and betting money is actually valued is one that could actually end up promoting a culture of accountability that would actually improve our discourse. Now, one of the things I talk about here is that what I'm calling for here, which is a return of betting markets coming to the fold. This is actually not a new concept, but it's one that actually has defined our political discourse for a long time. So in the late 19th century, and much like how our media today covers polling and other forms of expertise as a way to measure the presidential horse race during presidential elections, this is in fact the function that political prediction markets actually played really in the late 19th century through the 1930s. So you had these betting parlors and newspapers basically print market prices, and they would basically use this as a barometer to figure out what would happen in presidential elections, who was up, who was down. But what ended up happening, particularly after the 1930s, is that American norms around political gambling ended up departing from other Western democracies. So while you had it in places like the UK and Ireland, betting markets remained common and accepted, gambling acquired a social and then ultimately a legal stigma in the US. And so if you look, for example, at newspapers and political publications, from say the late 19th century through the 30s, and then from the 30s up to the present day, you see betting markets basically no longer being taken seriously, and instead there's much more of an emphasis on polling, expert opinion, other forms of authority, and this ended up basically now resulting in a situation where betting markets became highly regulated and ultimately sort of largely put out of business. Now, this is unfortunate because one of the things we've seen from academic research now on betting markets is that betting markets have value in the sense that the way markets move, that they end up revealing actually conveys information that's useful in and of itself. So one of the real scholars at the forefront of figuring this out was Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek, who's also obviously a libertarian icon. And he basically observed that market prices generally reflect the combined knowledge of relevant information that's dispersed out in the open. And that betting markets are a way of aggregating all this information that's out there that may not otherwise come to the fore. And that aggregate information ends up basically producing a market price. And so Hayek laid out a lot of the theoretical arguments, but then Hayek's intuition here really came to the fore and was vindicated when you look at some more recent studies on betting markets, where they found that at least in a certain array of contexts, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's politics, business, sports betting, horse racing, whatever, that the market price that emerges in betting markets can outperform not only expert opinion, but also polls and other predictive models of the sort that you see, like Nate Silver and others producing. Now, one of the things here that in making this argument, I received a comment to the article which I thought was interesting, and this is someone who is in my my predicted group, which you can learn more about in my ebook. But he wrote back. He said, "quote It's something of an irony in that legal betting markets will also be the most regulated, resulting in hamstrung sites like Predictit, while the black markets are able to offer a better product, but struggle to gain the needed liquidity." Then he writes, "I feel like it's a losing argument the issue in terms of the public of prediction markets, because it lets the debate focus on what other people think is a good use of my money. So, I share some of the libertarian intuitions of this commenter, and I think that we do need to make appeals on the basis of privacy and just individuals having the freedom and sovereignty to do what they want with their own money. The problem is that there are basically two big threats to betting markets, as the comment suggests. One is regulatory risk, and the other is liquidity. And so I'm going to talk about both of these. In the case of regulatory risk, one of the realities is that if you look at how and why betting markets are regulated, it stems from this idea that there's really no collective benefit, or in any case that the collective benefit of these markets is negative. And so you can see that, for example, that after the 9/11 attacks, the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, they wanted to pilot a prediction market that would basically allow people to bet on the likelihood of geopolitical catastrophes that were of obvious interest to the US. So these would be like assassinations of key foreign leaders, or the likelihood of a missile attack from North Korea. And the thinking here, obviously, is that we just had the 9/11 attacks, which is probably one of the worst predictive failures, in the sense that our intelligence agencies and experts and whatever else didn't really know it was coming. And so the argument is, if we can't rely on our current people in power, maybe markets might be able to tip us off to an emerging threat. Now, after it was leaked that the Pentagon Congress revolted, and they basically not only put an end to this project from coming to fruition, but they actually made the head of DARPA resign. And then what you had after that was a series of other regulatory efforts that really took aim at political prediction markets. So you had in 2006, the Unlawful Internet Gambling Act. And what this did was basically prohibit transactions between US financial institutions and online gambling entities, both in the US and abroad. And I think the main target of this was online poker, but it ended up basically putting out of business a whole gamut of betting markets in all different sectors. And then you had on top of that in 2010 the Dodd-Frank Act. And one of the things that they did, and you'll see here how they appeal to this ideas, but they say that one of the things in the Dodd-Frank Act is that it prohibits future markets on anything, quote, contrary to the public interest. This is the term they use. But they include in that terrorism, gaming, and assassination, which, if you accept my argument, not only are these things not contrary to the public interest, but actually having betting markets on these issues would actually very much reveal information of the sorts that would actually improve our public policy. So, one of the things that would, the second issue here is that you have, so even if, and here's where I think the commenter here is not recognizing here what's at stake, is that even if you had total deregulation of betting markets, even if you had black markets or whatever else where people were allowed to bet without having concerns about regulatory risk, one of the realities is that the reason why betting markets are not as popular as they should be is because of our cultural stigma that's really associated around gambling, where people basically feel like, well, even if it's legal to do, it's kind of dirty, it's low class, it's uncouth, it's immoral. And so, but one of the things that I would argue is that if we really want betting markets to come to the fore, we also have to have a paradigm shift in our culture about how we view gambling and what its utility is. And so one of the reasons that I think it's important to make these arguments about the public interest in betting markets is to lift this stigma that we have. I mean, I would even go as far as to say that although regulatory and government challenges to betting markets are serious, in I think that the most serious threat to betting markets right now is actually self-regulation, which is basically people who have the ability to bet in markets, make money in them, but who choose not to do so out of a sense of propriety or whatever else. And so I think making this argument that betting markets have value, I think there are basically two lines of argumentation that I would recommend. The first is really to recognize that when you have betting markets, you create a culture of accountability, because what basically happens is two things. One is that when forecasters and experts and others are actually forced to put their own money on the line in betting markets, what you end up having is an objective track record where clear metrics are established that indicate how reliable someone is in making accurate forecasts. And as we mentioned, is the market price that results from thousands of exchanges in the betting markets then provide information and offer clues on how likely an event is to happen. Now, my own view is that although the public policy rationale on the civic argument for gambling is probably strongest in this realm of foreign policy, national security, and also in the business corporate world, where, for example, like major companies could have betting markets that try to predict what their stock earning would be like or what the consequence would be of a business decision. I think where we're likely to really have a concerted push against these regulatory mechanisms is in the realm of sports betting. Because here, I think you know, unlike with political prediction markets, which at this point are just very kind of a niche quality or a niche habit or practice, in sports betting, I think despite the legal stigma, you do have at least in the U.S., a culture where people like to participate in it. So you have March Madness, and you have on ESPN, they talk about different brackets and other things. And so there's a culture oriented around it with betting. You also just have a larger industry of people who fanatically follow sports and who sort of intuit at some level, even if they don't quite articulate it, is that like when you bet on your home team, you're somehow participating in a collective civic exercise. And just on a practical matter too, when you look at these major companies who have a stake in online sports betting, DraftKings, FanDuel, some of these other ones, they're really equipped with the financial resources and so forth to really an expensive advocacy campaign that would be required to lift a lot of these legal barriers. And so what I think can happen is that if you have a concerted lobbying campaign, advocacy campaign that breaks down legal sanctions on betting markets, and then you also have a cultural shift where more and more people just sort of view it as being okay to participate in betting markets, that's when you would get the not only formal barriers lifted to betting markets, but you would also have more and more money coming in, which would provide the liquidity in these markets to actually be able to do what I argue can be done. And I think an analogy here to think about is that prediction markets in many ways could follow the path that you've seen of other financial instruments that used to be deemed illegal or immoral, but basically gained moderate practice on different regimes. So a good example here would be something like life insurance, where if you go back and really look at the history and the conception of life insurance, a lot of people argued that this was immoral to create markets that were predicting people's death and that they were playing around with that and maybe creating bad incentives. But over time, people recognized that with a just more complex world where we had to allocate risk and allow people to do things like drive a car or whatever else. Basically, life insurance became more and more accepted, and now we just take it for granted that these are things that we need, irrespective of older cultural norms and whatever else. And I think that hopefully that's the path that that betting markets will follow. Yeah, if you're interested in the subject, check out the article. And if you want to deep dive into this issue, check out my ebook, How to Make Money from Political Predictions, where I talk about a lot of the history of how political prediction markets have evolved, how they've been regulated, and what a path might be to bring these about, and how they might improve an expert political culture that really is now broken and in a state of crisis.